Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, California. In October 1959, Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson was in his 7th year of a 15-year sentence at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, the maximum security prison on an island in San Francisco Bay that housed America's most dangerous criminals. Johnson was 54 years old, serving time for federal narcotics conspiracy, one of approximately 260 inmates confined to The Rock, where escape was considered impossible and where violence simmered constantly beneath the surface of enforced routine and rigid discipline. Johnson had arrived at Alcatraz in June 1953, and by October 1959, he'd established himself as someone to be respected, a former Harlem crime boss who'd controlled millions of dollars in illegal gambling operations, who'd survived decades of gang wars, who carried himself with quiet dignity that commanded respect from other inmates regardless of their race or criminal background. Among black prisoners especially, Johnson was legendary, a man who'd built an empire in Harlem, who'd stood up to Italian mob families, who represented black power and black success in a world dominated by white criminal organizations. But not everyone at Alcatraz respected Bumpy Johnson, and one man in particular, a massive white prisoner named Eric Paulson, would learn in the most violent and permanent way possible that disrespecting Johnson carried consequences that no amount of size or strength or murderous reputation could protect against. According to 17 former Alcatraz inmates who were present during October 1959 and who spoke with Prison Chronicles between 1965 and 1970, what happened in the prison cafeteria on October 23, 1959, became the most legendary act of violence in Alcatraz history. Not because of its brutality — Alcatraz had seen far more brutal attacks — but because of how swiftly it happened, how strategically it was executed, and how completely it ended racist harassment that had been escalating for an entire week. Eric Paulson, 38 years old in October 1959, was exactly the kind of prisoner that Alcatraz was designed to contain: violent, sadistic, racist, and utterly unrepentant about any of it. Paulson stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, weighed approximately 275 pounds of muscle, built through years of prison weightlifting, and had been convicted of 3 separate murders, all of black men, committed during armed robberies in Texas between 1954 and 1956. According to court records and prison files, Paulson had specifically targeted black victims because, in his own words during his trial, killing, racial slur, isn't really murder, it's pest control. He'd shown no remorse during sentencing, had laughed when the judge called him a racist monster, and had promised he'd kill more black people if he ever got out of prison. Alcatraz received Paulson in 1957 after he'd assaulted multiple black prisoners at other federal facilities, making him too dangerous to house in regular prisons. At Alcatraz, Paulson continued his pattern of racist violence and intimidation, but in a more calculated way that avoided the kind of obvious attacks that would land him in solitary confinement indefinitely. Paulson was smart about how he terrorized people, says Marcus Williams, a black inmate who served at Alcatraz from 1958 to 1964 and who witnessed the incident involving Johnson. Williams spoke with Prison Chronicles in 1968. He didn't just attack people openly where guards would see. He'd do little things that humiliated and intimidated, but that weren't technically violent enough to get him thrown in the hole. He'd take food off black prisoners' trays during meals. He'd bump into black prisoners in the shower or in the yard, making it look accidental, but doing it hard enough to hurt. He'd whisper racial slurs when guards weren't close enough to hear. He'd make it clear that he considered black prisoners to be beneath him, that he thought Alcatraz was too good for racial slur, that we should all be working in fields or cleaning toilets rather than housed with white criminals who'd committed real crimes. By October 1959, Paulson had been at Alcatraz for 2 years and had established himself as someone who intimidated most prisoners, not just black inmates, but even white inmates who didn't want to risk confrontation with someone that large and that violent. Guards tolerated Paulson's behavior to a degree because he was smart enough not to cross the line into attacks that would require serious punishment, and because some guards, though this was never officially acknowledged, shared Paulson's racist views and quietly approved of how he kept racial slur in their place. Paulson thought he was untouchable, Williams recalls. He'd killed 3 black men on the outside and felt no guilt about it. He was bigger and stronger than almost anyone at Alcatraz, and he'd been getting away with his intimidation tactics for 2 years without serious consequences. So, when Bumpy Johnson arrived in 1953 and established respect among other prisoners, Paulson saw that as a challenge. He saw this older black man. Bumpy was 54 in October 1959, while Paulson was only 38, getting respect from both black and white prisoners, and Paulson couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand seeing a racial slur being treated like he mattered. So Paulson decided he was going to humiliate Bumpy, break him down, show everyone that no racial slur was above being put in his place by a superior white man. The escalating confrontation between Eric Paulson and Bumpy Johnson began on Friday, October 16, 1959, during the lunch meal period in Alcatraz's main cafeteria. According to witnesses, Johnson was sitting at a table with 3 other black inmates, eating quietly, when Paulson walked past carrying his own tray. Without breaking stride, Paulson reached down and took Johnson's dessert, a small piece of apple pie that was part of the standard meal, and continued walking to his own table, where he sat down and ate the pie while staring at Johnson with obvious contempt. According to witnesses, Johnson looked at where his dessert had been, looked at Paulson eating it, and then returned to eating his own meal without any visible reaction. Everyone at Bumpy's table was ready to fight, Williams recalls. We were ready to stand up and confront Paulson for disrespecting Bumpy like that. But Bumpy just shook his head slightly, telling us to stay calm, and kept eating like nothing had happened. We didn't understand at first. We thought maybe Bumpy was afraid of Paulson because Paulson was so big. But later we understood. Bumpy was giving Paulson rope to hang himself. Bumpy was letting Paulson think he could get away with disrespect so that Paulson would keep escalating until he crossed the line where Bumpy could respond with overwhelming violence that would be justified as self-defense. The second incident occurred on Monday, October 19th in the communal shower area. Johnson was showering when Paulson entered, walked directly toward Johnson despite plenty of other shower stations being available, and shoved Johnson hard enough that Johnson slipped on the wet floor and had to catch himself against the wall to avoid falling. "That's my shower," racial slur, Paulson said loudly enough that everyone in the shower area heard clearly. "Find another one. This one's for white men only." According to witnesses, Johnson stood up slowly, water dripping from his body, and looked at Paulson for several seconds without speaking. Then Johnson simply moved to a different shower station and finished washing without saying anything or showing any anger. Again, everyone watching thought Bumpy was being weak, Williams says. Paulson had just physically assaulted him and used a racial slur, and Bumpy just walked away. But those of us who knew Bumpy from his reputation understood what he was doing. He was making Paulson confident. He was making Paulson think Bumpy was an easy target who could be pushed around, and that confidence would make Paulson careless. The third incident occurred on Wednesday, October 21st, during the outdoor recreation period, when inmates were allowed in the prison yard for 1 hour. Johnson was walking the perimeter of the yard with 2 other inmates when Paulson deliberately blocked their path. "Get out of my way, racial slur," Paulson said, standing directly in front of Johnson. "I walk straight. You walk around. That's how it works in here. White men walk straight. Racial slurs walk around." According to witnesses, Johnson looked at Paulson for a moment, then simply stepped off the path and walked around him without responding to the racial slur or the confrontation. Paulson laughed loudly and called after Johnson, "That's right, racial slur. You know your place. You keep walking around white men like a good racial slur should." By Wednesday evening, October 21st, everyone at Alcatraz was talking about the confrontations between Paulson and Johnson. Some inmates thought Johnson was showing weakness by not responding to Paulson's provocations. Others, particularly older inmates who understood prison politics better, suspected Johnson was planning something and was waiting for the right moment. "I talked to Bumpy Wednesday night in our cell block," Williams recalls. "I asked him why he wasn't standing up to Paulson, and Bumpy smiled slightly and said, 'I'm giving him enough rope to hang himself. Right now, if I attack him, guards will see it as me starting a fight and I'll go to solitary. But if I let him keep pushing, eventually he'll do something that crosses the line. And then I can respond in a way that guards will understand was justified. Be patient. This will resolve itself very soon.'" The final escalation occurred on Thursday, October 22nd, the day before the cafeteria incident that would become legendary. During the afternoon recreation period, Paulson approached a young black inmate named Robert Jackson, 23, who was sitting alone on a bench reading a book. "What are you reading, boy?" Paulson asked, snatching the book from Jackson's hands. "Are there pictures in it?" "I didn't know racial slurs could read words without pictures." According to witnesses, Jackson, who was small, maybe 140 pounds, serving time for postal fraud, and who'd never been violent, tried to take his book back politely. "Please give that back, sir. I was reading it." Paulson responded by hitting Jackson across the face with the book, knocking Jackson off the bench onto the ground, and then throwing the book into a puddle of dirty water that had collected near a drain. "That's what I think of racial slurs who think they're smart enough to read," Paulson said, standing over Jackson, who was holding his face where he'd been hit. "You're not smart. You're not equal to white men. You're racial slurs, and racial slurs belong on the ground where I just put you." Guards broke up the confrontation before it went further, but they didn't punish Paulson severely. He received a verbal warning and lost 1 day of recreation privileges. Jackson was sent to the infirmary with a split lip and a black eye. That evening, Bumpy Johnson sat with several other black inmates in their cell block, and according to Williams, who was present, Johnson made a statement that everyone understood meant something was going to happen very soon. Tomorrow at lunch, Paulson is going to learn a lesson he'll remember for the rest of his life. I've been patient. I've let him think he can disrespect me without consequences. I've let him think that being big and violent makes him untouchable. But tomorrow, he's going to understand that size doesn't matter when someone has the intelligence and the willingness to use violence more strategically than he does. Tomorrow, Alcatraz is going to see what happens when a racist bully picks the wrong target. The main cafeteria at Alcatraz, Federal Penitentiary, seated approximately 250 inmates at long tables arranged in rows, with guards stationed at strategic positions around the perimeter, watching for any signs of trouble. Meals were regimented. Inmates filed in, received their food, sat at assigned tables, ate in silence or with minimal conversation, and filed out within 45 minutes. Violence during meals was relatively rare because guards had clear sight lines to every table, and because inmates knew that starting a fight in the cafeteria would result in immediate solitary confinement. On Friday, October 23, 1959, at approximately 12:15 p.m., inmates filed into the cafeteria for lunch. Bumpy Johnson, wearing the standard prison-issued clothing, received his food tray and walked to his assigned table, where he sat with 3 other inmates and began eating quietly. Eric Paulson entered the cafeteria 2 minutes later, received his tray, and instead of going to his own assigned table, walked directly to Johnson's table and sat down in an empty seat across from Johnson, setting his tray down with deliberate force. "Well, well," Paulson said loudly enough that nearby tables could hear. "If it isn't Harlem's racial slur king. Still eating with your racial slur friends, I see. Still thinking you're somebody important instead of just another racial slur who belongs in a cage." According to witnesses, Johnson continued eating without looking up, without acknowledging Paulson's presence or his racial slurs. This non-response seemed to anger Paulson, who wanted a reaction. "You ignoring me, boy?" Paulson said, leaning forward across the table toward Johnson. "You think you're too good to respond when a white man talks to you? Let me explain something. Racial slur. You're not too good for anything. You're a racial slur. That means you're beneath me. That means when I talk to you, you respond respectfully or you face consequences." Paulson then turned his attention to Robert Jackson. The young inmate Paulson had hit with a book the previous day, who was sitting 3 tables away. Jackson's face still showed bruising from where Paulson had struck him. "Hey, racial slur boy," Paulson shouted across the cafeteria at Jackson. "How's your face feeling today? You learn your lesson about reading books you're not smart enough to understand? Maybe I need to come over there and teach you another lesson." Jackson, according to witnesses, looked down at his food, trying to avoid Paulson's attention, clearly terrified. Some of the other black inmates at Jackson's table started to stand up, preparing to defend him if Paulson approached, but guards shouted for everyone to remain seated. And then Bumpy Johnson stood up. According to 17 witnesses who saw what happened next, the entire sequence of events lasted approximately 3 to 4 seconds. Johnson stood up from his seat at the table, and as he stood, his right hand moved to his waist, where his prison shirt was tucked, into his pants. In one smooth motion that was so fast that most witnesses didn't clearly see it happen, Johnson withdrew something from where it had been hidden against his body. A blade approximately 4 inches long that had been fashioned from a piece of metal sharpened to a razor edge, a weapon that in prison parlance was called a shank, and that experienced inmates could make from various materials and hide in ways that even thorough searches often missed. Johnson walked around the table toward where Paulson was sitting, moving quickly but not running, covering the 8 feet between them in approximately 2 seconds. Paulson saw Johnson approaching and started to stand up, his hands moving to defend himself or to attack. But Johnson was faster. Johnson's right arm moved in a horizontal slash across Paulson's face from left to right, a motion that took less than 1 second, and the shank's blade cut a deep gash across Paulson's face from his left cheekbone to his right jaw, opening a wound approximately 7 inches long that immediately began pouring blood. Paulson screamed, a sound witnesses describe as shock and pain combined, and his hands went to his face, trying to stop the blood that was now flowing down his neck and onto his prison shirt. But Johnson wasn't finished. Before guards could react, before Paulson could defend himself, before anyone could intervene, Johnson's arm moved again, this time in an upward diagonal slash from lower right to upper left, and the blade cut another deep gash across Paulson's face, this one crossing the first wound at an angle and catching Paulson's right eye, slicing through the eyelid and into the eye itself. Paulson collapsed backwards, falling over the bench he'd been sitting on, landing on the cafeteria floor in a spreading pool of his own blood, screaming continuously now, his hands covering his ruined eye, blood streaming through his fingers. The entire cafeteria erupted in chaos. Guards rushed toward the scene, blowing whistles, shouting orders for everyone to get down on the floor. Inmates scattered or dove under tables. Within 15 seconds, 5 guards had surrounded Johnson with weapons drawn, while 2 other guards went to Paulson, who was writhing on the floor, blood pooling around him from the 2 facial wounds. Johnson dropped the blade on the floor, held his hands up to show he was no longer armed, and allowed guards to force him to the ground and handcuff him without resistance. But before guards could drag Johnson away, before they could get Paulson medical attention, Johnson said one sentence that every witness heard clearly, and that would be repeated in prisons across America for the next 50 years. Touch that young brother again, call him one more racial slur, and next time you won't visit a doctor, you'll visit God. Eric Paulson survived the attack, but was permanently disfigured and partially blinded. The first slash across his face required 127 stitches and left a scar that ran from his left cheekbone to his right jaw, a mark that he would carry for the rest of his life. The second slash destroyed his right eye completely, requiring emergency surgery to remove what remained of the eyeball and leaving Paulson blind on his right side permanently. Paulson was transferred to the prison hospital, where he remained for 2 weeks, recovering from his injuries. According to medical staff who treated him, Paulson was a changed man after the attack: quiet, withdrawn, no longer aggressive or threatening. The physical damage was severe, but the psychological damage was perhaps worse. Paulson had believed himself to be untouchable because of his size and his violent reputation, and Johnson had destroyed that belief in 3 seconds. Paulson never threatened another black prisoner after that attack, says Williams. He'd learned what every bully eventually learns if they live long enough. Size and strength don't matter when someone has a weapon, and the willingness to use it without hesitation. Bumpy had shown Paulson, had shown everyone at Alcatraz, that being 275 pounds of muscle meant nothing against someone who understood violence at a deeper level, who could strike faster than you could defend, who could permanently damage you before you even realized you were in danger. Bumpy Johnson was immediately placed in solitary confinement, pending investigation. The investigation lasted 2 weeks and included interviews with dozens of witnesses. What investigators discovered was exactly what Johnson had calculated. Multiple witnesses testified that Paulson had been harassing and threatening black prisoners for weeks, including taking Johnson's food, shoving Johnson in the showers, blocking Johnson's path in the yard, and using racial slurs constantly. Witnesses testified that Paulson had physically assaulted Robert Jackson the day before the cafeteria incident, hitting him with a book and knocking him to the ground while calling him racial slurs. Witnesses testified that on the day of the attack, Paulson had sat at Johnson's table uninvited, had used racial slurs toward Johnson repeatedly, and had then threatened Jackson across the cafeteria. Johnson's own statement to investigators was simple and consistent. "I defended myself and another inmate from a racist prisoner who'd been threatening us for a week. I used the minimum force necessary to ensure he would stop threatening us. I had warned him. I told him after the attack that if he continued his behavior, consequences would be worse next time. I don't regret defending myself. I don't regret defending Robert Jackson. I regret that violence was necessary, but it was necessary because guards weren't protecting us from Paulson's harassment." After 2 weeks in solitary confinement, prison officials made a decision that surprised many people. Johnson would receive additional time in solitary, 30 days total, for possession of a weapon and for assault, but he would not face additional years added to his sentence because investigators concluded that Johnson had been provoked by Paulson's sustained harassment and that the attack, while excessive in its violence, was understandable given the circumstances. The prison administration didn't want to admit it publicly, Williams explains, but they knew Paulson had been terrorizing black inmates for years and that guards had done nothing to stop it. They knew Paulson had assaulted Jackson the day before. They knew Paulson was sitting at Bumpy's table using racial slurs and threatening another inmate when Bumpy attacked him. So punishing Bumpy too severely would mean admitting that the prison administration had failed to protect inmates from a known racist bully. Instead, they gave Bumpy 30 days in the hole, enough punishment to satisfy rules against weapons and violence, and then they quietly transferred Paulson to another facility when he recovered, effectively admitting that Paulson was the problem, not Bumpy. What happened in Alcatraz's cafeteria on October 23, 1959 became legendary not just at Alcatraz, but in federal prisons across America. Inmates transferred from Alcatraz to other facilities carried the story with them. Guards talked about it. Prison officials wrote about it in reports. And the story grew with each retelling until it became a legend that defined Bumpy Johnson's reputation for the rest of his time in prison and for the rest of his life. The legend emphasized several key elements: the strategic patience. Johnson had endured a week of harassment without responding, letting Paulson grow confident and careless, waiting for the moment when response would be justified. The speed and precision. 2 slashes in 3 seconds that permanently disfigured and partially blinded a man before guards could react or before the victim could defend himself. The weapon. No one knew where Johnson had hidden the blade or how he'd smuggled it into the cafeteria. That mystery added to the legend, suggesting Johnson had capabilities and resources that other inmates couldn't match. The message: touch that young brother again, and next time you'll visit God. The statement became famous in prison culture as the perfect threat, specific, clear, and absolutely believable, coming from someone who just demonstrated the willingness and ability to inflict devastating violence. The age factor. Johnson was 54 years old when he attacked Paulson, while Paulson was 38 and significantly larger physically. The fact that an older, smaller man had destroyed a younger, larger man so quickly and efficiently became part of the legend, proving that intelligence and experience were more valuable than size and strength. The legend of what Bumpy did to Paulson spread through every federal prison in America within a year, says Williams. Inmates in Atlanta and Leavenworth and Marion were talking about it. Black inmates especially saw it as justice. One, of their own, standing up to a racist bully and permanently ending that bullying in a way that guards never could or would. The story became inspiration. If you're being harassed by racists, if you're being threatened by people who think they're untouchable, remember what Bumpy Johnson did at Alcatraz. Be patient, be strategic, and when the moment is right, respond with overwhelming violence that ends the threat permanently. When Johnson was released from solitary confinement, after 30 days, he returned to general population and found that his reputation had changed completely. According to Williams and other inmates, white racist prisoners who'd previously felt comfortable using racial slurs around black inmates now kept their mouths shut when Johnson was present, understanding that crossing him could result in permanent disfigurement. Young black inmates treated Johnson with reverence, seeing him as someone who defended one of them against a racist bully when no one else would. Even guards showed more respect, understanding that Johnson wasn't just another inmate, but someone who could and would use strategic violence when necessary to protect himself and others. After the Paulson incident, nobody messed with Bumpy Johnson at Alcatraz, Williams says. Nobody took his food. Nobody pushed him in the showers. Nobody used racial slurs around him. The word had spread. Bumpy Johnson might be 54 years old, might look like an aging criminal who's past his prime, but he's more dangerous than men half his age because he's smarter, more patient, and willing to use violence with surgical precision when he needs to. That reputation protected Bumpy for his remaining 4 years at Alcatraz until his release in 1963. And it protected every black inmate at Alcatraz because racists understood that if they targeted black inmates, they might face retaliation from Bumpy, and nobody wanted that. Robert Jackson, the 23-year-old inmate Paulson had been threatening when Johnson attacked, served the remainder of his sentence at Alcatraz and was released in 1962. According to Jackson's later accounts to friends and family, the cafeteria incident changed his life by teaching him about courage, justice, and standing up to bullies. Mr. Johnson saved me that day, Jackson told his family after his release, according to accounts shared with Prison Chronicles. Paulson had been terrorizing me for weeks. I'm small, I'm not violent, I couldn't defend myself against someone that big. I thought I'd have to endure his abuse for my entire sentence. And then Mr. Johnson, who barely knew me, who had no obligation to help me, stood up and permanently ended the threat in 3 seconds. He risked additional prison time to defend me. He used violence on my behalf when I couldn't use it myself. That taught me that there are people in this world who'll stand up for you when you can't stand up for yourself, and that justice sometimes requires violence when peaceful means fail. Jackson never saw Johnson again after their respective releases from Alcatraz, But Jackson kept a newspaper clipping about Johnson's 1968 death, and at Jackson's own funeral in 1997, his family found the clipping in Jackson's wallet along with a handwritten note. "He saved me when no one else would. He showed me what courage looks like. RJ, 1962. Eric Paulson was transferred from Alcatraz to USP Leavenworth in Kansas in December 1959, 2 months after the cafeteria attack. According to prison records and accounts from inmates who served with Paulson at Leavenworth, Paulson was a changed man after his encounter with Johnson, physically disfigured with a massive facial scar and blind in one eye, but also psychologically broken by the realization that his size and violence hadn't protected him. Paulson served the remainder of his sentence at Leavenworth and was released in 1971. He returned to Texas, worked various manual labor jobs, and died in 1989 at age 68. According to people who knew him in Texas, Paulson rarely talked about his prison time, but when he did, he would touch the scar on his face, a mark that remained prominent even 30 years after Johnson had put it there, and say, "I learned the hard way that being big doesn't make you tough, and being tough doesn't make you smart. I thought I was the most dangerous man at Alcatraz. Turns out I wasn't even close." Bumpy Johnson was released from Alcatraz in November 1963 after serving 10 years of his 15-year sentence. He returned to Harlem, reclaimed control of his criminal empire, and lived until July 1968 when he died of a heart attack at age 62. But the story of what Johnson did to Eric Paulson in the Alcatraz cafeteria on October 23, 1959, outlived Johnson by decades. The story was told in prisons across America, was referenced in books about prison culture, was retold by former inmates who'd served at Alcatraz, and who wanted to share the legend of how one man had ended racist harassment with 2 slashes of a blade and 1 perfect threat. That cafeteria attack defined Bumpy Johnson's reputation in ways that nothing else he did could match, says Marcus Williams, who remained friends with Johnson after both men were released from Alcatraz. Everyone knew Bumpy had been a successful criminal in Harlem. Everyone knew he'd survived gang wars and built an empire. But the Alcatraz incident showed something deeper. It showed that even at 54 years old, even after years in prison, Bumpy was still the most dangerous person in any room because he combined intelligence with absolute willingness to use strategic violence. That combination, patience, intelligence, and overwhelming violence applied at exactly the right moment, that's what made Bumpy legendary. Not the violence itself, but the strategic brilliance of how and when he used it. The phrase, "Next time you'll visit God," Johnson's threat to Paulson after the attack, became one of the most quoted lines in prison culture, used by inmates across America as a way to warn potential enemies that escalation beyond a certain point would result in death rather than just injury. And the legend of the attack itself, 2 cuts across the face in 3 seconds, blood everywhere, a racist bully permanently disfigured and blinded, became a cautionary tale about what happens when bullies pick the wrong target, when racists assume that their size or their violence makes them untouchable, when prisoners forget that the quietest, oldest inmate might be the most dangerous person in the entire facility. That was October 23, 1959. That was the day Eric Paulson learned that Bumpy Johnson, at 54 years old, decades past his physical prime, was still capable of violence that would make a 275-pound triple murderer scream in terror. That was the slice that became legend, the attack that showed every prisoner in America that age doesn't diminish danger when intelligence and strategic thinking guide. The violence. That was the 3 seconds that proved why you never, ever disrespect Bumpy Johnson. Because he'll give you enough rope to hang yourself, and then he'll cut you so fast and so precisely that you'll be bleeding before you realize you've been attacked, and you'll carry the scars of your mistake for the rest of your life.